My soul shall live for him, my descendants shall serve him. They shall be known as the Lord's forever. They shall come and make known to a people yet unborn the saving deeds that he has done. As most of you know, my youngest son Jude is pretty active in his scout troop in Madison, and he's been active in scouting since he was very little. It was very surprising to me. He actually just saw a sign in a lawn one time that said, "Join the Cub Scouts," and he was curious about it, and we went to a meeting when he was about 7 years old, and he has been fully into scouting ever since. And one of the things that we did in that early days of scouting was he started with a cohort of scouts and the Cub Scouts that had the fella in it who runs the Veterans Museum down on the Capitol Square in Madison was one of the parents. And in fact, when I was sitting having my coffee this morning, I saw that in the newspaper, this fellow was actually out in Richland Center very recently to talk at the American Legion. But this fellow who runs the museum there and kind of coordinates all of the stories and the tales about U.S. veterans in our state, he decided that one of the outings we're going to have is he was going to take all these little 7-year-old boys to the Veterans Museum downtown. And so we all met there, and it was actually, when it was closed, it was very cool. We got to go in and just have the run of the place, and he took us in all the places of the museum that you don't get to go when you are there just visiting or stop in or get a regular tour. We got to go down in the vault, and he showed us the door that was the tunnel to go over to the Capitol building under the street. He just, all the stuff that these boys were just completely fascinating with, and many of the adults as well. But the thing that the fellow was most interested in showing all of us that day was a chest that they had just gotten there at the museum. There was this footlocker, and it had been donated by a family, and when they had gotten it, it had a padlock on it. And the family had come in and they brought it, and they could tell by the look of it that it was of some kind of military issue. But even the grandkids actually didn't know that their grandfather had served in World War II. And when they went through the attic after Grandpa had died, they didn't know what it was. And they found out from an aunt or uncle that their grandfather had served in the Army in World War II. And so they thought, well, we don't know what's in this thing. Let us bring it to the Veterans Museum, and we will find out what's in it, and we'll just have a donation. So they brought it there, and they got some bolt cutters, and they got the padlock open on it. And what it was that they had found in a very far corner of the attic of their grandfather's house, a grandfather they didn't even know had served in the military, were all of the things that he had brought home from the war. And they were in the same condition as they had been the day he had gotten home. They were still folded and creased, his uniform. There were knives. There was a gun in there. There were papers and books. And what it seemed had happened was that this fellow had gotten home from the war, and he wanted to forget about it. And anything that had tied himself at all to it, he had put in this chest, and he put a padlock on it, and he put it in the attic. And he never told anybody that he was even a soldier. Now, I can only speculate why that is, but I don't think I have to speculate very hard. Most of you also do know people that have served in the military or have served in the armed forces. They don't like to really talk about it when they get back. And the reason is because it's terrible. It's awful. The things that they see and the things that they have to do. When they get back, they do all in some fashion, maybe not as extreme as this grandfather had. I mean, these children were blown away when they opened it up to even see what rank their grandfather had been. But most people that come back from seeing awful things put them in a chest, they put a padlock on them, they put them away in the attic, and hopefully they'll never talk about it. Now, there are all kinds of other things that we all have in our own families that are similar to this. It might not be grandparent that was a soldier, but it might be a grandparent who was adopted or was a foster parent, or there might be some kind of other family secrets that are out there that we don't talk about. And sometimes things start to happen again in families, and we wonder why they happen again. Well, part of the reason they happen again is because we treat the bad things in life like we don't want to talk about them. We want to keep them secret. And I imagine, and it might be a wishful hope, that if when soldiers came back, they talked about how awful war was, we might stop fighting wars. And my guess is if we found out how awful it is when families split up and break up, if we told those stories to our children, they might think twice about the choices they make in their lives as well. And I also think that if we told the story of Jesus on the cross in the right way, we might behave differently in the future as well. Because the story we have of Jesus today is a story that we don't really like to talk about. In fact, I know we don't, because I'm certain, because it happened to me, even though I read this every year, some detail of the horrific nature of the story was brought present to me that I had forgotten about. And now it's made fresh. If we talk about the story of Jesus on the cross in a way that is meaningful, it might break that cycle. It might have us make different decisions in the future than the ones that we've made in the past. No, I'm not trying to intimate that we never talk about the cross. In fact, we talk about it all the time. In fact, I think we talk about it in ways that are not helpful. We often do talk about the part that Jesus did in some kind of theological way to take care of the sins of the world. And I think the reason we do that is because we want to put away all of the awful things that happen around it. We want to sanitize it. I also think there are unhelpful ways that we talk about the cross when we talk about it as something like we actually did, though none of us were alive. But we want to associate that one sin in the dark place in our lives with the reason that Jesus gets on the cross. But that's giving ourselves too much credit. And that might make us feel guilty, but it might not change our lives. But I think there's a way we need to tell the awfulness of this story so that it changes the way that we behave in the future. And to do that, we have to understand why Jesus is on that cross. He's not on that cross because any decision or anything one person made. He's on that cross because people behaved absolutely normally and as the status quo around him on that day. Jesus doesn't get on the cross because of some conspiracy or some plot or some evil plan of some person. Jesus is on the cross because people are doing the things they think are supposed to be normal. I'm certain that the priest, Annas, who says one should die so the people don't die, thinks he's protecting the people around him by putting Jesus on the cross. He doesn't think he's enacting some plan for the universe that is evil or is from the mind of Satan. He thinks if we do this, it will keep us safe. In Caiaphas, he is not trying to think that he is going to hold all of the power of the religious system of Judaism in his hands. He thinks he's protecting his faith, of which Jesus is a threat to it. And I'm sure Pilate thinks he's just trying to keep the peace in a land that is already a powder keg. And I think Judas thinks he's probably protecting his friends by letting Jesus go and not raising a ruckus anymore. I'm sure the soldiers are there, think that they are just trying to keep the order and the peace to protect and serve the people around him. So when we tell the story, which we shouldn't tell it as though something unique happened on that day to Jesus. We should first tell it that this is the way human beings act when they act out of anxiety and fear for mustering their own power and protecting themselves and excluding others and punishing those who are threatening and labeling people as enemies. Because that's status quo behavior. And you know what status quo behavior always ends in? Well, we see it every day in the news. Status quo behavior ends in violence. And we have to tell the stories of violence to remember how awful it is and to break it. So why do we tell this particular story of violence? Because this is the story that breaks the cycle. Jesus acts with a collective memory of the stories he's heard from the Old Testament. He acts in the way that he is remembering the violence that he's seen around him in his own day. He's acting on the recent history. He has seen reports from other parts of the Roman Empire. He says, I know all of this is going on, and you know what I'm going to do? I'm not going to behave that way. In fact, he acts the opposite. He doesn't act in a way that protects. He acts in a way that surrenders. And that's what's unique about this story of violence. And that's what's unique about Jesus. Because Jesus is not the only Messiah of first century Judaism. In fact, there are dozens of them. But I bet you can't name any of them. And I know you don't worship any of them. And I doubt anybody remembers who they are. And the reason is, when they were the Messiah, they acted like the status quo. They were going to go down swinging. They were going to go down wreaking havoc and causing violence. And all it made them was maybe a footnote in somebody's academic paper somewhere. But Jesus, in his story of violence, which should we be telling all the time, acts differently. And that's why we continue to tell it. It's not that he couldn't have acted in that way. He could have. He had followers. Anybody could start a riot. But he broke the cycle, and he surrendered. And because he did, we follow him. So when we go out to tell the story, one, that we should remember how awful it is so we never do it again. We should not tell it in a way as though it is some way we acted out of character. It was fully in character. But Jesus responded in a way that we had not been able to. And in that way, he released us from that sin cycle that we were in. So let us tell his story, how painful it was, and how he acted. Because ultimately, we follow him because he surrenders. And more importantly, God glorified him for doing so.